Hi, I just wanted to go through Katherine Mansfield's The Fly with you today, just to make it a little bit easier. Thanks. Y'all are very snug in here, piped old Mr. Woodfield, and peered out of the great green leather armchair by his friend the boss's desk as a baby peers out of its pram. His talk was over. It was time for him to be off, but he didn't want to go. Since he had retired, since his stroke, the wife and the girls kept him boxed up in the house every day of the week except Tuesday. On Tuesday he was dressed and brushed and allowed to cut back to the city for the day. Though what he did there the wife and girls couldn't imagine. Made a nuisance of himself to his friends, they supposed. Well, perhaps so. All the same, we cling to our last pleasures as the tree clings to its last leaves. So there sat old Woodfield, smoking a cigar and staring almost greedily at the box, who rolled in his office chair, stout, rosy, 5 years older than he, and still going strong, still at the helm. It did one good to see him. So as you look at that first part, let's take a look at some of the literary devices and the purpose of those devices. So what literary device does the narrator use when he says, or when she says, we cling to our last pleasures as the tree clings to its last leaves? So as most of you know, it's comparing two things. It's comparing how people might cling to their last pleasures, and it's comparing that to a tree and how trees cling to their last leaves. Now, it could be a metaphor or a simile, as you know, because it's comparing two things, but because you can see the as there, you know that in this case it's a simile. Now, there can be many purposes to devices, and so it's really interesting to look at why they might actually say that. So we have Woodfield, and Woodfield is obviously older, and he's a little distressed, perhaps, by the fact that he can't work as much. And so one of his pleasures is going into work, and he likes to go and talk to his friend, the boss. Likewise, the boss is 5 years older than him, and while he's even going strong, there is still a sense of oldness. And so what the purpose of this device to a certain extent is that both of these men are older. It's showing that they're nearing the end of their lives. And you'll see this a little bit more clearly as the story progresses. Wistfully, admiringly, the old voice added, "It's snug in here, upon my word." "Yes, it's comfortable enough," agreed the boss. And he flipped the Financial Times with a paper knife. As a matter of fact, he was proud of his room. He liked to have it admired, especially by old Woodfield. It gave him a feeling of deep, solid satisfaction to be planted there in the midst of it in full view of that frail old figure in the muffler. "I've had it done up lately," he explained, as he had explained for the past how many weeks. "New carpet," and he pointed to the bright red carpet with a pattern of large white rings. "New furniture," and he nodded toward the massive bookcase and the table with legs like twisted treacle. "Electric heating," he waved almost exultantly towards the 5 transparent, pearly sausages glowing so softly in the tilted copper pan. But he did not draw old Woodfield's attention to the photograph over the table of a grave-looking boy in uniform standing in one of those spectral photographers' parks with photographers' storm clouds behind him. It was not new. It had been there for over 6 years. So the next question is, describe the renovations the boss points out to Woodfield. Of course, he talks about the new carpet or the flooring that he's recently had done. He talks about the new furniture, specifically a massive bookcase and a table with legs. He talks about the electric heating, and he's very proud of the fact that it will warm the room, essentially. Now, the one object, as you can clearly see, is the photograph that he does not point out to Woodfield. We don't know exactly why he doesn't point out the photograph, but it has something to do with the grave-looking boy in uniform. And again, as you'll see as we continue to read, the grave-looking boy ends up being his son. Now, I do want you to look at the contrast between the excitedness of pointing out the rest of the room and then the words that Mansfield uses when she's talking about the photograph or writing about the photograph. So he exultantly looks at waves his hand toward the heating, the pattern of large red rings. It's a very excited paragraph, as contrasted with the paragraph about the photograph. Grave-looking boys, storm clouds. It had been there for over 6 years. It was not new. And so there's definitely a contrast between these two paragraphs, between what the boss is willing to talk about and not talking about. The effect of the contrast is interesting because there's different things that you can talk about here, but know that by setting up the newness and then the oldness, it really is setting up a difference between the feelings of the boss. And you'll see this a little bit more clearly in the next section. "There was something I wanted to tell you," said old Woodfield, and his eyes grew dim, remembering. "Now what was it? I had it in my mind when I started out this morning." His hands began to tremble. The patches of red showed above his beard. "Poor old chap, he's on his last pins," thought the boss, and feeling kindly, he winked at the old man and said jokingly, "I'll tell you what, I've got a little drop of something here that'll do you good before you go out into the cold again. It's beautiful stuff. It won't hurt a child." He took a key off his watch chain, unlocked the cupboard below his desk, and drew forth a dark, squat bottle. "That's the medicine," said he, "and the man from whom I got it told me on the strict QT. It came from the cellars of the Windsor Castle." Old Woodfield's mouth fell open at the sight. He couldn't have looked more surprised if the boss had produced a rabbit. "It's whiskey, ain't it?" he piped feebly. The boss turned the bottle and lovingly showed him the label. Whiskey it was. "You know," he said, peering up at the boss wonderingly, "they won't let me touch it at home," and he looked as though he was going to cry. "Ah, that's where we know a bit more than the ladies," cried the boss, swooping across the 2 tumblers that stood on the table with the water bottle, and pouring a generous finger into each. "Drink it down. It'll do you good. And don't put any water with it. It's sacrilege to tamper with stuff like this." He tossed off his, pulled out his handkerchief, hastily wiped his mustaches, and cocked an eye at old Woodfield, who was rolling in his chaps. The old man swallowed, was silent a moment, and then said faintly, "It's nutty." But it warmed him. It crept into his chill old brain. He remembered. "That was it," he said, heaving himself out of his chair. "I thought you'd like to know. The girls were in Belgium last week, having a look at poor Reggie's grave, and they happened to come across your boys. They're quite near each other, it seems." Old Woodford paused, but the boss made no reply. Only a quiver in his eyelids showed that he heard. All right, so pretty easy, straightforward question. What do we learn about the bosses and Woodfield's sons? As you can see from this excerpt, both of them died, and both of them died during the war. What is the boss's response? He obviously hears what Woodfield says, but he doesn't really show that he hears what Woodfield has said. The only indication that he knows is the quiver in his eyelid. "The girls were delighted with the way the place is kept," piped the old voice. "Beautifully looked after. Couldn't be better if they were at home. You've not been across, have you?" No, for various reasons the boss had not been across. "There's miles of it," quavered old Woodfield, "and it's as neat as a garden. Flowers growing on all the graves, nice broad paths." It was plain from his voice how much he liked a nice broad path. The pause came again. The old man brightened wonderfully. "Do you know what the hotel made the girls pay for a pot of jam?" he piped. 10 francs! Robbery, I call it. It was a little pot, so Gertrude says, no bigger than a half-crown, and she hadn't taken more than a spoonful when they charged her 10 francs. Gertrude brought the pot away with her to teach him a lesson. Quite right, too. It's trading on our feelings. They think because we're over there having a look around, we're ready to pay anything. That's what it is. And he turned toward the door. What distresses Woodiford about the jam? Obviously, the price of it. The jam is much more expensive than he wanted or Gertrude even wanted to pay for it. Quite right, cried the boss. Though what was quite right, he hadn't the least idea. He came around his desk, followed the shuffling footsteps to the door, and saw the old fellow out. Woodfield was gone. For a long moment the boss stayed, staring at nothing, while the gray-haired office messenger, watching him, dodged in and out of his cubbyhole like a dog that expects to be taken for a run. Then, "I'll see nobody for half an hour, Macy," said the boss. "Understand? Nobody at all." "Very good, sir." The door shut. The firm, heavy steps recrossed the bright carpet. The fat body plumped down in the spring chair, and leaning forward, the boss covered his face with his hands. He wanted, he intended, he had arranged to weep. It had been a terrible shock to him when old Woodfield sprang that remark upon him about the boy's grave. It was exactly as though the earth had opened up, and he had seen the boy lying there with Woodfield's girls staring down at him. For it was strange. Although over 6 years had passed away, the boss never thought of the boy except as lying unchanged, unblemished in his uniform, asleep forever. "My son," groaned the boss, but no tears came yet. In the past, in the first months, and even years after the boy's death, he had only to say those words to be overcome by such grief that nothing short of a violent fit of weeping could relieve him. Time, he had declared then, he had told everybody, could make no difference. Other men perhaps might recover, might live their loss down, but not he. How was it possible? His boy was his only son. Ever since his birth, the boss had worked at building up the business for him. It had no other meaning, as if it was not for the boy. Life itself had come to have no other meaning. How on earth could he have slaved, denied himself, kept going all those years, without the promise forever before him of the boy stepping into his shoes and carrying on where he left off? And that promise had been so near being fulfilled. The boy had been in the office learning the ropes from a year before the war. Every morning they had started off together. They had come back by the same train, and what congratulations he had received as the boy's father. No wonder. He had taken to it marvelously. As to his popularity with the staff, every man, jack of them down to old Macy, couldn't make enough of the boy. And he wasn't in the least spoiled. No, he was just his bright, natural self, with the right word for everyone, with that boyish look and his habit of saying simply splendid. But all that was over and done with, as though it had never been. The day had come when Macy had handed him the telegram and brought the whole place crashing about his head. "Deeply regret to inform you," and he had left the office a broken man, with his life in ruins. 6 years ago. 6 years. How quickly time passed. It might have happened yesterday. The boss took his hands from his face. He was puzzled. Something seemed to be wrong with him. He wasn't feeling as he wanted to feel. He decided to get up and have a look at the boy's photograph. But it wasn't a favorite photograph of his. The expression was unnatural. It was cold, even stern-looking. The boy had never looked like that. What was the boss's hope for his son? As you can see by looking up a bit, the main objective of the boss was to have the boy, his boy, take on the boss's business. So as it said in the previous slide, the boss really only continued to work because he had thought that his son was going to take over the business. At that moment, the boss noticed that a fly had fallen into his broad ink pot and was trying feebly but desperately to clamber out again. "Help, help," said those struggling legs. But the sides of the ink pot were wet and slippery. It fell back again and began to swim. The boss took up a pen, picked the fly out of the ink, and shook it onto a piece of blotting paper. For a fraction of a second it lay still in the dark patch that oozed round it. Then the front legs waved, took hold, and pulling its small, sodden body up, it began the immense task of cleaning the ink from its wings. Over and under went a leg along a wing, as the stone goes over and under the scythe. Then there was a pause, while the fly, seeming to stand on the tips of its toes, tried to expand first one wing and then another. It succeeded at last, and sitting down it began, like a minute cat, to clean its face. Now one could imagine that the little front legs rubbed against each other lightly, joyfully. The horrible danger was over. It had escaped. It was ready for life again. So what happens to the fly? I'm sure you can tell by going through that the fly basically falls into the ink pot, and the poor fly's about to die. But instead of dying, the boss turns the ink pot over and gets the fly out and puts it on a piece of paper. So the fly can symbolize many things, and really it's going to be up to you to determine what your reading of this story is. I believe that the fly probably symbolizes his son, or all of the soldiers who end up in the war and die. And as you'll see, what the boss does to the fly in going forward, and it might make more sense. Of course, it can also be the boss himself. He can feel as if for a minute he's found some peace from the death of his son. And so, again, he can feel that continuously coming back too. So it's really up to you to look at it and determine what you think the fly may symbolize. But just then the boss had an idea. He plunged his pen back into the ink, leaned his thick wrist on the blotting paper, and as the fly tried its wings, down came a great heavy blot. What would it make of that? What indeed? The little beggar seemed absolutely cowed, stunned, and afraid to move because of what would happen next. But then, as if painfully, it dragged itself forward. The front legs waved, caught hold, and, more slowly this time, the task began from the beginning. He's a plucky little devil, thought the boss, and he felt a real admiration for the fly's courage. That was the way to tackle things. That was the right spirit. Never say die. It was only a question of... But the fly had again finished its laborious task, and the boss had just time to refill his pen, to shake fair and square on the new cleaned body yet another dark drop. But what about it this time? A painful moment of suspense followed, but behold, the front legs were again waving. The boss felt a rush of relief. He leaned over the fly and said to it tenderly, "You artful little bee." And he actually had the brilliant notion of breathing on it to help the drying process. All the same, there was something timid and weak about its efforts now, and the boss decided that this time should be the last, as he dipped the pen deep into the ink pot. It was. The last blot fell on the soaked blotting paper, and the draggled fly lay in it and did not stir. The back legs were stuck to the body. The front legs were not to be seen. "Come on," said the boss, "look sharp." And he stirred it with his pen in vain. Nothing happened, or was likely to happen. The fly was dead. What does the boss do to the fly, and why? So the boss, as again, you can see pretty clearly, he continues to put ink on the fly. He does it 3 times, and then the fly can no longer take the ink or the pressure of the ink and cannot clean himself that very last time and ends up dying. Again, this leads to the theme of the story and what the fly actually symbolizes. And again, it really is for you to be able to go back and find evidence to support what you believe is the actual theme of this story. So you can say that we continue to put our boys in the war, and by doing that, it costs us a lot. We put them in danger. We continue to put them in danger, and by doing that, they ultimately died, like the boss's son and like Woodafield's son, Reggie. Now it can also be the boss. He can be continuously reliving the idea of his son. And by continuing to relive the idea of his son, he feels as if he is continuously dragged down. But it's up for you to decide, and it's up for you to go through and find text evidence to support whichever side or whichever one you believe to be true. And if you come up with a completely different one, that's okay too. You just need to make sure that you support what you write with text evidence. The boss lifted the corpse on the end of the paper knife and flung it into the waste paper basket. But such a grinding feeling of wretchedness seized him that he felt positively frightened. He started forward and pressed the bell for Macy. "Bring me some fresh blotting paper," he said sternly, "and look sharp about it." And while the old dog padded away, he fell to wondering what it was he had been thinking about before. What was it? It was, he took out his handkerchief and passed it inside his collar. For the life of him, he could not remember. So again, what is the theme of the fly? You need to go ahead and figure out what you believe to be the theme of the fly. I've given you a couple ideas as to Mansfield's ultimate message to us. Please just give me a written response to that. What evidence from the text can you use to support your theme? Again, make sure that you're finding that text evidence. Which literary device does Mansfield most prominently use to promote her theme? And I think this is undoubtedly symbolism. The symbolism of the fly is the most evident or most prominently used in this story. As you'll see in Google Classroom, I have also put the Word document of this. And at the bottom of the Word document are multiple choice questions. Please go ahead and answer those multiple choice questions for me. Let me know if you have any questions yourself, and have a wonderful, wonderful week.